The Meridian's hope wasn't much to look at. A mid-sized cargo hauler that had seen better decades, with hull plating that showed its age and systems that required constant maintenance to keep functioning within acceptable parameters. But it was reliable in the way old ships often were, and it paid decently for crew willing to work long hauls between frontier colonies and core worlds. Ethan Wright had signed on 18 months ago when his previous vessel had been decommissioned, and he'd stayed because the work was steady and the crew was tolerable. Tolerable covered a range of personalities and species. The Meridian ran with minimal crew. Captain Torres, human, pragmatic to the point of being blunt. Chief Engineer Voss, Elthari, brilliant with systems and terrible with people. Medical Officer Kim, human, competent and perpetually exhausted. 3 cargo handlers including Ethan, 2 maintenance techs, and their navigator Senna. Senna was Thelian, which made her something of a rarity in human-operated cargo vessels. The Thelian were excellent navigators. Their species had evolved with enhanced spatial awareness that made them naturally suited for stellar cartography, but they rarely integrated well into mixed crews. Their culture valued emotional restraint and formal protocols, and their distinctive appearance often made other species uncomfortable in ways nobody wanted to acknowledge openly. Ethan had been on the Meridian for a year when Senna joined the crew, and his first impression had been the same as everyone else's, striking and slightly unsettling in the way alien features often were to human eyes. She was tall, nearly 6.5 feet, with angular features that were almost but not quite human familiar. Her skin had a slight translucent quality, and beneath it ran luminescent markings, patterns that traced along her arms, up her neck, across her cheekbones, that shifted in color with her emotional state. Blues and greens when she was calm, purples when concentrating, other colors for states Ethan hadn't learned to read yet. The crew had quickly learned that Senna preferred solitude. She performed her navigation duties with exceptional competence, attended required briefings with precise formality, and spent the rest of her time in her quarters. She ate alone, didn't participate in the casual social interactions that developed among crew members during long voyages, and generally made it clear through consistent behavior that she wasn't interested in connection beyond professional necessity. Most of the crew had accepted this as normal Thelian behavior and left her alone. Ethan had intended to do the same, except somewhere around month 3 of working the same shift cycles, he developed a problem. He couldn't stop looking at her. It started with the markings. The luminescent patterns were genuinely fascinating, shifting through colors with subtle complexity that suggested emotional depths he couldn't fully interpret. He'd catch himself glancing up during cargo operations just to see what color they were showing, trying to decode what the shifts meant. Then he'd started noticing other things. The way she moved with precise economy, no wasted motion, completely comfortable in her own space. The angle of her features that he'd initially found unsettling, but gradually began to recognize as genuinely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with human standards. The rare moments when she showed any expression, usually brief flashes of concentration or satisfaction when solving navigation problems, that revealed personality beneath the formal exterior. 6 months into her tenure on the Meridian, Ethan had privately admitted to himself that he found Senna absolutely striking. Not despite her alien features, but because of them, because she was different in ways that were captivating rather than uncomfortable. He was also convinced he'd been completely subtle about his attention. Quick glances during shift changes, brief observations when their work brought them into the same spaces, nothing obvious or inappropriate. Just harmless appreciation from a distance. He was, in retrospect, spectacularly wrong about his subtlety. The shift cycle that changed everything started routinely enough. Ethan was running inventory checks in Cargo Bay 2, confirming container positions and ensuring proper load distribution for their upcoming FTL jump. It was mindless work that let his thoughts wander, which meant his attention wandered too, specifically to the observation window where Senna was visible in the adjacent navigation bay, reviewing stellar chart updates. Her markings were showing cool blues and greens, indicating calm concentration. Ethan watched the colors shift as she manipulated holographic displays, finding himself wondering again what the different shades meant, whether the slight warming toward teal indicated satisfaction or just a change in focus. He realized he'd been staring for at least 30 seconds and forced his attention back to his work. This was exactly the kind of obvious watching he'd been trying to avoid. If anyone noticed, right, you need something. Chief Engineer Voss's voice crackled over the comm, making Ethan jump slightly. Negative, Chief. Just running standard checks. Then run them faster. We've got 3 hours before jump prep and I need those numbers confirmed. Understood. Ethan focused on his work with determined intensity, pushing thoughts of luminescent markings and elegant movement firmly aside. The shift continued through standard operations. Cargo checks, load balancing, system confirmations, the routine maintenance that kept a vessel like the Meridian functioning. Ethan crossed paths with various crew members, exchanged brief updates with the other cargo handlers, and carefully didn't let his attention drift toward navigation even when he knew Senna was working nearby. He almost made it through the entire shift without incident. The problem came during final inspection in Cargo Bay 3, where Ethan was confirming container seal integrity before they secured everything for FTL. He was working methodically through the manifest when movement caught his peripheral vision. Senna entering the bay to check something on the environmental controls that regulated atmosphere for the more sensitive cargo. Ethan's attention shifted automatically, watching her move through the bay with that characteristic Thelian grace. Her markings were showing deeper blues now, probably indicating focus on technical work. She was halfway across the bay when she paused, adjusted something on her data pad, and looked directly at him. Ethan's brain caught up to the fact that he'd been staring again, and he quickly redirected his attention to the container seals with sudden intensity that probably fooled no one. He heard footsteps approaching, measured, deliberate footsteps that stopped precisely at professional distance but close enough that he had to acknowledge the presence. Right. Senna's voice was exactly as formal and controlled as always, giving away nothing. Ethan looked up, trying to project casual professionalism. Senna, something I can help with. She studied him for a moment, her expression perfectly neutral, her markings shifting to colors he didn't recognize, deeper purples mixed with something that might have been red. When she spoke, her tone remained formal, but the question was anything but, "Why are your eyes always on me, human?" Ethan felt his brain stall out completely. "I what?" "Your observation, your attention." She gestured slightly, a small, precise movement. "You watch me during shift changes. You follow my movements when we share spaces. Your eyes seek me out frequently enough that I've documented the pattern over the past 4 months." Her head tilted slightly. "Why? I don't—" Ethan started, then stopped because lying seemed both impossible and insulting. "I wasn't aware I was being that obvious." "You were, you are." Her markings shifted again, colors he still couldn't interpret. "I'm asking what your purpose is." The way she said purpose carried weight, as if she'd already formed conclusions about his intentions and was giving him a chance to confirm or deny them. Ethan felt heat rising to his face, embarrassment mixed with the growing horror of being called out for behavior he genuinely thought was subtle. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he managed. "It wasn't intentional, I mean. The watching was intentional, but making it obvious wasn't." He was making this worse with every word. "You haven't answered my question." Senna's voice remained level, but something in her posture had shifted slightly, became more rigid. Humans often find Thelian appearance unsettling. The markings, the features that approximate human but remain distinctly other. I'm aware that my presence makes some crew members uncomfortable, though they're professional enough not to express it directly. She paused. I assumed your frequent observation was either fascination with alien features or monitoring to ensure I don't infringe on personal space. I'm asking you to clarify which, or if there's a third explanation I haven't considered. Ethan stared at her, comprehension dawning with sick certainty. She thought he'd been watching her because he found her unsettling, because he was uncomfortable with her presence and was keeping track of her movements to maintain distance. The complete opposite of his actual feelings, but a logical conclusion if she'd been interpreting his attention through the lens of her own experiences with human reactions to Thelian presence. That's not, he stopped, recognizing that he'd reached a point where careful diplomatic phrasing would just make things worse. That's completely wrong. I don't find you unsettling. Her markings shifted again, deeper colors that carried notes of skepticism. Then explain your observation pattern. Ethan took a breath, abandoned any remaining thought of maintaining professional distance, and committed to honesty because nothing else was going to fix this misunderstanding. I watch you because you're beautiful, he said simply. Your markings are fascinating, the way they shift colors is mesmerizing, and your features are striking in ways I can't stop noticing. I've been trying to be subtle about it because I didn't want to make things awkward, but apparently I failed at subtle. I'm not monitoring you out of discomfort. I'm watching because I find you genuinely, completely beautiful. The silence that followed was absolute. Senna's markings went through rapid shifts, blues to purples to colors Ethan had never seen before, bright ambers and warm golds mixed with something that looked almost like silver. Her expression, typically neutral and controlled, showed complete shock. "You're serious," she said finally, and it wasn't quite a question. "Completely serious. You find Thelian appearance attractive. I find your appearance attractive. Specifically, you." Ethan felt like he'd jumped off a cliff and was currently in free fall, but he'd already committed. "I realize that's probably not appropriate to say, and I apologize if I've made working together uncomfortable, but that's the actual reason I've been staring. Not discomfort or fascination with alien features. Just you." Senna continued staring at him, her markings cycling through colors that suggested she was processing information that didn't fit her existing frameworks. When she spoke again, her formal control had cracked just enough to show genuine confusion. "Humans don't typically," she stopped, recalibrated. "You're not making a joke, not making a joke, promise." "Then you're." She seemed to struggle for words, which was remarkable given her typically perfect speech. "You genuinely mean this?" "Yes." Before either of them could say anything else, the cargo bay's comm system crackled to life with Captain Tor's voice. "All crew prep for FTL jump in 30 minutes. Confirm positions and secure stations." The spell broke. Senna's attention snapped to the comm, her formal protocols reasserting themselves with visible effort. Her markings shifted to cooler blues but with undertones of those warm golds still visible. "I need to return to navigation," she said, her voice controlled again but not quite as steady as usual. "Right, of course." She turned to leave, made it several steps, then paused and looked back. Her markings were showing colors Ethan desperately wanted to understand but couldn't quite interpret. "Your answer was unexpected," she said quietly. Then she left, moving quickly through the cargo bay exit. Ethan stood alone among the cargo containers, his heart still racing, wondering if he'd just made everything infinitely worse or possibly, improbably, opened a door he hadn't known existed. His data pad chimed with a reminder to complete the inspection reports. He stared at it blankly, then at the exit Senna had taken, then back at his data pad. "Well," he said aloud to the empty bay, "that happened." Somewhere in the distance, the ship's engines began their pre-jump sequence, and Ethan returned to his work while his brain tried to process the fact that he'd just confessed attraction to his Thelian crewmate, and she'd looked at him like he'd spoken in a language she didn't know he could speak. The next few hours were going to be interesting. The FTL jump went smoothly, which meant Ethan had nothing to distract him from replaying his conversation with Senna approximately 700 times in his head. Each replay made him question different aspects. His phrasing, his timing, whether beautiful had translated properly through whatever cultural context Senna was working from, and most persistently, whether he just destroyed the most professional working relationship on the ship by being catastrophically honest. The shift after jump completion found him in the maintenance bay, running diagnostic checks on cargo handling equipment, with the kind of intense focus that usually indicated someone avoiding thinking about other things. It wasn't working. "You're tense," observed Carries, one of the other cargo handlers, a human who'd been with the Meridian even longer than Captain Torres. "Bad jump. Jump was fine." "Then why do you look like someone who just confessed to a crime?" Ethan didn't answer, which apparently was answer enough. "Oh no." Carrie set down her tools and looked at him with the expression of someone about to hear something they'd rather not know. "What did you do? Why do you assume I did something? Because you've got that specific look that says, I said something I can't unsay and now I'm living with consequences. I've seen it before. Usually right before someone requests a transfer." She paused. "Please tell me you didn't insult Captain Torres again." "I didn't insult anyone. Opposite, actually." Understanding dawned on Carrie's face. "You finally talked to Senna." Ethan's head snapped up. "What do you mean, finally?" "Right, you've been watching her like she's the most interesting thing on this ship for months. Everyone's noticed." "Well, everyone except apparently Senna until now, I'm guessing." She grinned. "What happened?" "She noticed. Asked me directly why I was always watching her. And you said, the truth." Ethan returned to his diagnostics with unnecessary force. "That I find her beautiful and can't stop looking at her." Carries whistled low. "Bold. How'd she take it?" "Shocked. Confused. Her markings went through about 15 colors I've never seen before. Then we got the jump warning and she had to return to navigation." "And you haven't talked to her since?" "It's been 12 hours. That's not that long. It feels long." Ethan set down his tools before he broke something. "I misread the entire situation. She thought I was watching her because I found her unsettling, that I was monitoring her presence out of discomfort. She had no idea it was attraction." "Well, now she knows." "Yeah, and I have no idea if that made things better or catastrophically worse." They worked in silence for a few minutes before Carrie spoke again. "For what it's worth, I think it's about time someone actually talked to her like she's not made of glass and cultural complications." "Meaning?" "Meaning everyone tiptoes around her because she's Thelian and formal and seems to prefer being left alone. But maybe she's alone because everyone keeps their distance, and everyone keeps their distance because she seems to prefer being alone." Classic feedback loop. Carrie shrugged. "Your honesty might have actually broken that cycle, or made me the guy who made navigation shifts incredibly awkward. Time will tell." Time, as it turned out, told fairly quickly. Ethan encountered Senna during the evening shift change, in one of the ship's narrow corridors that made avoiding people essentially impossible. He saw her approaching and briefly considered whether it was too late to take an alternate route, decided that would be cowardly, and maintained his course. They met in the middle of the corridor, both stopping at professional distance. Senna. Right. Her markings were showing cautious blues with undertones of those warm golds from yesterday, a combination Ethan desperately wanted to interpret correctly. "I need to speak with you." "Okay. Not here, too public." She glanced around the corridor, though it was currently empty except for them. "My quarters, if you're comfortable with that, or the observation deck if you prefer neutral ground." Ethan's brain caught up to the fact that Senna was initiating private conversation, which was something she'd never done with any crew member since joining the Meridian. "Your quarters are fine." "When?" 30 minutes. "After you complete your shift logs." "I'll be there." She nodded once, precise and formal, then continued past him down the corridor. Ethan watched her go, noting that her markings were cycling through colors that seemed to indicate uncertainty mixed with determination. 30 minutes later, he stood outside Senna's quarters, questioning every decision that had led to this moment. He'd been in crew quarters before for various social reasons, but Senna's had always been off-limits territory, her private space that she maintained as a retreat from the social demands of ship life. He pressed the door chime before he could overthink it further. Enter. The door slid open. Senna's quarters were similar in layout to his own, compact but functional, with the same standard furnishings all crew were provided. What was different was the personalization. Most crew quarters showed signs of occupation, pictures, personal effects, the accumulated evidence of someone living in a space. Senna's quarters were almost austere in their minimalism, with one notable exception. The walls were covered in stellar charts. Not the standard navigation displays but hand-drawn maps, intricate and beautiful, showing star patterns and spatial relationships in ways that were more art than data. "Those are amazing," Ethan said, momentarily distracted from his nervousness. "Navigation practice, also meditation." Senna gestured for him to sit in the quarter's single visitor chair while she remained standing, her posture formal but with a tension that suggested she was as uncertain about this conversation as he was. "I've been thinking about our conversation in the cargo bay. I should apologize if I made you uncomfortable. You confused me, not the same thing." She cut him off with precise directness. "I've been trying to understand your statement, that you find me beautiful. It's true. I've worked among other species for 3 years, served on 4 different vessels before the Meridian. Humans generally find Thelian appearance interesting or unsettling, occasionally intimidating, not beautiful." She paused. "Never beautiful." Then they weren't looking properly. Her markings flared bright gold for a moment before she controlled them back to cooler colors. "You're either remarkably unusual for a human or saying what you think I want to hear." "I'm saying what I think. I've thought for months. You're striking, your features, the way you move, definitely your markings. I've been trying not to stare obviously and failing." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "I'm sorry if that's made you uncomfortable, but I'm not sorry I feel it." Senna was quiet, processing. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its careful control. "Do you understand what Thelian markings represent in my culture? Emotional display, involuntary expression, shame." The word came out flat. In traditional Thelian society, visible emotional states are considered loss of control. Our markings make emotional concealment difficult. Every feeling shows itself in colors we can't fully control. It's considered a weakness. Most Thelian who work off-world are those who struggle with emotional restraint, who find our cultural protocols suffocating. She gestured to her own markings. "I left because I couldn't maintain proper control. The markings showed too much, too often. Better to work among species who don't understand the display than remain where everyone can read my inadequacy constantly." Ethan felt several pieces of understanding slot into place. "That's why you isolated yourself. Not because Thelian prefer solitude, but because you expected the crew to find your markings either uncomfortable or invasive. Humans find emotional display awkward when they can't interpret it. Easier to avoid social situations where my markings might reveal things that make others uncomfortable." She looked at her hands, where the luminescent patterns traced delicate lines. "When you said you find them fascinating, I didn't know how to process that. No one has ever called them anything but interesting or unusual." "They're beautiful. You're beautiful. That's not a complicated statement." "It's complicated to me." Her markings shifted through several colors rapidly. "I need to understand if you're genuinely expressing attraction or if you're trying to be kind to someone who's clearly isolated." Ethan stood, moving closer but still maintaining respectful distance. "I'm genuinely expressing attraction. Have been for months. I watch you because I want to. Because you're compelling in ways I don't have better words for." Senna's markings blazed with those warm golds again, brighter than before. "I've never," she stopped, recalibrated. "Thelian courtship is complex, formal, Attraction is never stated directly. There are protocols, intermediaries, carefully coded communication. You just said it directly. Human approach. We're bad at subtle when it really matters. It's confusing, but is it unwelcome? She looked at him directly then, and for the first time since he'd known her, her markings showed colors he could actually interpret with confidence. Warm golds that indicated pleasure, mixed with softer greens that seemed like hope. No, not unwelcome. Very unexpected, but not unwelcome. They stood in her quarters, two people from different species trying to navigate feelings that transcended cultural protocols and translated awkwardly across biological differences. Ethan had no idea what happened next, but for the first time since his accidental confession, he thought maybe it hadn't been the disaster he'd feared. "I don't know how to do this," Senna said quietly. "Cross-species relationships aren't common among Thelian. I don't have frameworks for navigating this." "Neither do I, but maybe we figure it out together." Her markings brightened further, and despite her typically controlled expression, Ethan caught the hint of a smile. "That would require me to spend time in social spaces, to not isolate myself. Would that be terrible? It would be different, possibly uncomfortable." She paused. "But your attention is uncomfortable in ways I'm discovering I don't actually mind." "Is that Thelian for yes, let's figure this out? It's Senna for I'm willing to try if you are." "I am. Definitely am." They talked for another hour, careful conversation about boundaries and expectations and how to navigate interest across cultural divides. When Ethan finally left her quarters, returning to his own section of the ship, he felt like he was walking on uncertain ground that might yet become solid. Behind him, in quarters that had been purely functional retreats, Senna stood among her stellar charts with her markings showing colors that suggested something between cautious hope and genuine anticipation. Sometimes the most important conversations were the ones that started with confrontation and ended with understanding. Sometimes admitting you'd been watching someone was the beginning rather than the end of a story. And sometimes honesty, however awkwardly delivered, was exactly what someone needed to hear. The next 48 hours were strange in ways Ethan hadn't quite anticipated. Senna didn't suddenly transform into a social butterfly. That would have been inconsistent with everything about her personality. But subtle changes appeared that the crew noticed with varying degrees of surprise and awkward adjustment. She appeared in the crew galley during communal mealtime instead of taking food back to her quarters. She sat at Ethan's table, not speaking much but present in a way she'd never been before. The other crew members at the table, Carries, and one of the maintenance techs, handled it with the kind of stilted politeness people used when trying very hard not to acknowledge something unusual was happening. "So Senna," Carries ventured after several minutes of awkward silence, "how's navigation? Stars still. Navigating properly?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly, recognizing this as Carries's attempt at inclusive conversation, and also perhaps the worst opening question possible. "Navigation systems are functioning within normal parameters," Senna responded with her typical formal precision, apparently not noticing or choosing to ignore the awkwardness. "The recent stellar chart updates have been comprehensive." "That's good." The conversation limped along for a few more exchanges before the maintenance tech made an excuse about checking environmental systems and escaped. Carries lasted another 5 minutes before also departing, leaving Ethan and Senna alone at the table. "That was uncomfortable," Senna observed. "Yeah, they're not used to you being here." "I'm not used to being here." She looked at the mostly empty galley. "This is harder than I expected." "We can leave if you want." "No." Her markings shifted to determine purples. "I've spent 6 months avoiding social situations because I assumed people preferred my absence. If I'm going to change that assumption, I need to actually be present even when it's uncomfortable." Ethan felt something warm in his chest that might have been admiration. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing great." "I'm sitting silently at a table making people uncomfortable. That's not great by most social metrics." Its progress. Over the next week, the pattern continued. Senna appeared in communal spaces more frequently, responded to casual conversation even when it was awkwardly delivered, and gradually became less of a mysterious figure who preferred isolation and more of a crew member who was just naturally reserved. The crew adjusted, though some faster than others. Ethan spent time researching Thelian culture more thoroughly than he'd bothered to before, diving into the ship's extensive database on species customs and social structures. What he learned made Senna's behavior make considerably more sense. Thelian society had evolved with strong emphasis on emotional control, specifically because their luminescent markings made emotions so visible. In a culture where everyone could literally see your feelings displayed on your skin, developing protocols to minimize emotional expression had become social necessity. The markings that Ethan found beautiful were considered problematic in traditional Thelian contexts, a biological trait that made proper social interaction difficult. Thelian who worked off-world were often those who'd struggled with their culture's restrictions, who found the constant emotional management exhausting, or who'd been judged as having insufficient control. Leaving to work among species who couldn't fully interpret the markings was a way to escape constant social judgment. Senna, Ethan realized, had probably expected isolation among the Meridian's crew, not because Thelian preferred solitude, but because she'd anticipated being judged or found uncomfortable. His admission that he found her markings beautiful rather than awkward had disrupted that entire framework. He got a chance to discuss this with her during a maintenance shift in one of the ship's environmental control sections, a quiet area where they were working together on routine system checks. "I've been reading about Thelian culture," Ethan mentioned while recalibrating atmospheric sensors. "Oh." Senna's voice carried amusement he'd learned to recognize even without seeing her markings. Dangerous territory for someone who already confessed to attraction. Cultural research might reveal information that changes your assessment. Actually, it explained a lot. Why you isolated yourself. Why my comment about your markings being beautiful was so shocking. He paused in his work to look at her. "Your markings aren't a flaw, Senna. They're remarkable." Her markings flared bright gold before she controlled them back to steadier colors. "You keep saying things like that." "Because I keep thinking them. It's still confusing." She moved to a different sensor panel, her movements precise, but with a tension that suggested internal conflict. "Thelian I've worked with before always treated the markings as something to be managed or ignored. Other species found them interesting but unusual, something to study rather than appreciate. You're the first person who's ever called them beautiful. Then everyone else wasn't paying proper attention. Or you're exceptionally unusual for a human." "Maybe both." Ethan returned to his recalibration work. "Can I ask you something personal? You've already confessed attraction and called me beautiful multiple times. I think we've exceeded personal already." He smiled at that. "Fair point. I'm wondering, why did you come work on the Meridian specifically? You could have joined a Thelian majority vessel where the cultural protocols would be familiar." Senna was quiet for a moment, her markings cycling through thoughtful blues and greens. When she spoke, her voice was more open than her typical formal register. "Thelian majority vessels are worse. Everyone can read my markings perfectly, which means every emotional response is visible and judged. At least among mixed crews, most people can't interpret the colors beyond basic recognition that they exist." She paused. "I chose the Meridian because it was small crew, long hauls, minimal social requirements. I thought I could do my work and avoid the complications of either being constantly judged or making others uncomfortable. And then I ruined that by watching you constantly. You disrupted my assumptions." "Not the same as ruining anything." Her markings shifted to warmer tones. "I've been thinking about our conversation, about your admission. And I've never experienced direct expression of attraction before. Thelian courtship involves intermediaries, formal arrangements, carefully coded communication. It's all very proper and completely removes the vulnerability of direct confession. She set down her tools and faced him. What you did, just stating your feelings honestly, it was frightening in its directness. I can try to be more subtle. No, the word was firm. I don't want subtle. Subtle is what I'm used to, and it's always felt like emotional dishonesty wrapped in protocol. Your directness is uncomfortable, but it's also refreshing, honest. Ethan moved closer, still maintaining the respectful distance they'd been careful about in public spaces. So where does that leave us? I'm not certain. I'm trying to understand if this is something I genuinely want, or if I'm just responding to the novelty of someone expressing interest directly. Her markings showed uncertainty, colors that cycled between warm and cool tones. But I think I'd like to find out. We can take it slow, no pressure. Slow feels appropriate. Though I should warn you that Thelian emotional responses are more visible than human ones. My markings will show things I'm not ready to verbalize. I can work with that. Can you? She gestured to her forearms where the luminescent patterns traced intricate designs. Right now they're showing that I'm nervous, interested, uncertain, and pleased all simultaneously. That's a lot of information to process about someone's emotional state. Ethan studied the colors, warm golds mixed with cooler blues, traces of green that seemed like hope, underlying purples that suggested concentration. I think I can learn to read them, if you're willing to teach me. That would require trusting you with emotional information most Thelian keep carefully concealed. I'm honored. Her markings brightened with what Ethan was learning to recognize as genuine pleasure. You make it sound simple. Maybe it is. Maybe we've been taught that everything has to be complicated when sometimes it can just be honest. They continued working on the environmental systems, but the conversation had shifted something fundamental. By the time the shift ended, Ethan had learned to recognize several more marking colors and their meanings, and Senna had relaxed enough that her typical rigid formality had softened into something more natural. The crew continued adapting to Senna's increased presence in communal spaces. Captain Torres pulled Ethan aside during a routine shift briefing to ask if the situation with our Thelian navigator was going to cause problems. Ethan assured her it wouldn't, though he wasn't entirely certain himself what the situation even was yet. Just keep it professional during work hours, Torres said pragmatically. I don't care what crew members do on their personal time as long as it doesn't affect ship operations. But I need to know that navigation and cargo operations can function without awkward tension. We're fine, Captain, professional. Good, because losing a competent navigator over personal drama would significantly complicate my operational planning. Ethan returned to his duties with the captain's warning echoing in his mind. Though honestly his bigger concern was whether he and Senna could actually navigate whatever was developing between them without it collapsing under cultural differences and biological barriers. That concern crystallized 3 days later during a cargo transfer operation at a frontier station. The operation was routine docking, unloading designated containers, loading new cargo for the next destination. But something went wrong with the loading mechanism. A container shifted wrong, safety protocols failed to engage properly, and suddenly, Ethan was in the wrong place at the wrong time with several tons of cargo threatening to crush him against the bay wall. He had about half a second to register the danger before training kicked in and he threw himself sideways, mostly clearing the danger zone, but not entirely. The container clipped his leg hard enough that pain exploded through his nervous system, and he went down hard. The bay's emergency protocols engaged immediately, stopping all cargo movement and flooding the space with safety lighting. Ethan heard voices shouting, felt hands pulling him further from the danger zone, registered that Medical Officer Kim was already on site and running scanners. What he registered most clearly, though, was Senna. She appeared in the cargo bay within seconds of the accident alarm, moving faster than he'd ever seen her move, her usual perfect control completely absent. Her markings were blazing with colors Ethan had never seen before, reds mixed with purples, urgent oranges, colors that suggested extreme emotional distress. Medical Officer Kim tried to wave her back, pointing out that she was technically abandoning her navigation post during a docking operation, which was a serious protocol violation. Senna ignored her completely, dropping to her knees beside Ethan with zero regard for proper social distance or emotional restraint. "You're injured." Her voice was tight with something that might have been panic. "I'm okay. Mostly. Leg's not great, but I'm okay." "Your leg is fractured," Kim interjected, still running her medical scanner. "You're going to medical bay now, and Senna, you need to return to navigation." "No." Senna's response was flat and absolute, her attention entirely on Ethan. Her markings were still showing those distress colors, bright enough that they lit her features from beneath. "I'm staying with him." "That's not negotiable." Senna's formal protocols had completely dissolved, replaced by raw emotional directness that shocked everyone in the bay, including, apparently, Senna herself, based on the brief flash of surprise that crossed her features. Medical Officer Kim looked between them, clearly calculating whether to argue, and apparently decided it wasn't worth the effort. "Fine, but you're both coming to medical bay now, and Captain Torres is going to want explanations for protocol violations." They got Ethan to medical bay, where Kim confirmed the fracture wasn't serious but would require treatment and rest. She gave him pain medication that made everything slightly fuzzy around the edges, then left to handle other duties, muttering something about filing incident reports. Senna remained beside the medical bed, her usual perfect posture rigid with controlled tension. Her markings had calmed slightly from the extreme distress colors, but were still showing combinations that suggested she was dealing with strong emotions. "You abandoned your post," Ethan said, his medication-fuzzed brain making his filter even worse than usual. "That's a serious protocol violation." "I know. Why?" She looked at him directly, and for the first time since he'd met her, every trace of formal control was gone from her expression. "Because the alarm said cargo bay accident and you work cargo operations and I couldn't." She stopped, took a breath. "I couldn't not come. Couldn't bear the thought of you injured without knowing if you were safe. Couldn't maintain professional distance when my actual feelings were demanding otherwise." "Your markings," Ethan observed, because the medication was making him notice details he might have politely ignored when more coherent, "are showing a lot of colors I don't recognize. Fear, distress, relief that you're not seriously hurt." She looked at her hands, where the patterns blazed with those unfamiliar reds and oranges, also probably revealing more emotional information than I'm comfortable with you knowing while you're medicated and unable to have proper conversation about it. "I can have conversation. I'm great at conversation right now." Despite everything, she smiled slightly. "You're altered. We should discuss this when you're coherent." "I'm coherent, and I still think you're beautiful. Even more now because you risked protocol violations to make sure I was okay." He reached out, his inhibitions thoroughly dissolved by medication and adrenaline aftermath, and took her hand. "That matters, Senna." Her markings shifted immediately to those warm golds he'd learned meant pleasure, mixed with greens that seemed like hope and something else, brighter colors that might have been joy. "You're going to make this very difficult," she said quietly. "Difficult how?" "Difficult to maintain proper Thelian emotional restraint when you say things like that." She didn't let go of his hand. "I'm starting to think proper emotional restraint is significantly overrated." "Revolutionary thoughts for a Thelian." "You make me think revolutionary thoughts." She squeezed his hand gently. "Your eyes are on me, human. They've been on me for months, and I've discovered I don't want them anywhere else." Ethan, medication fuzzy but emotionally clear, smiled at her. "Then they'll stay exactly where they are." They remained like that, Senna beside the medical bed, their hands connected, her markings showing colors that even he could now recognize as affection and determination. While Medical Officer Kim returned and raised her eyebrows at the scene but wisely said nothing about it. Outside the medical bay, the Meridian's crew was already circulating stories about how their reserved Thelian navigator had abandoned her post during a docking operation to check on an injured cargo handler. Captain Torres would have questions. Protocol reports would need filing. Complications would emerge. But for the moment, in the quiet of the medical bay, two people from different worlds sat together with a connection that transcended cultural protocols and made sense despite every reasonable argument for why it shouldn't. Sometimes the most important questions were the confrontational ones, and sometimes the most important answers were the honest ones, regardless of how inappropriate they might seem. Ethan's leg healed over the next 2 weeks with the help of medical technology, an enforced rest that made him a thoroughly unpleasant patient, according to Medical Officer Kim. He spent the recovery time catching up on research, reorganizing cargo manifests that didn't need reorganizing, and having regular visits from Senna that the crew had stopped pretending to not notice. The visits started formal, Senna bringing him data pads with work updates and maintaining proper physical distance, but gradually became more relaxed. By the second week, she'd sit on the edge of his medical bed during their conversations, her markings showing comfortable blues and greens, occasionally flaring to warmer colors when he said something that pleased her. "You're terrible at following medical orders," she observed during one visit, watching him attempt to work through physical therapy exercises before Kim had officially cleared him. "I heal faster if I'm moving." "You heal faster if you follow proper protocols," says the person who violated navigation protocols to check on me. Her markings flared bright gold. That was different. Hell, that was important. This is you being stubborn about rest requirements. Both can be true. She smiled, the expression becoming more natural the more time they spent together. "I've been thinking about what happens when you're cleared for duty." "Meaning?" "Meaning we've been existing in this bubble where you're recovering and I'm visiting, and neither of us has to fully address what this is or where it's going." Her markings shifted to more uncertain colors. "Once you're back on regular shifts, we'll need to actually define this." Ethan set aside the resistance band he'd been using for exercises. "What do you want it to be?" "I don't know. I've never had a relationship that wasn't arranged through proper Thelian intermediaries and formal protocols. This is entirely outside my experience." She paused. "I know I enjoy your company. I know your attention makes me feel things I've spent years trying to suppress according to cultural training. I know that when the— Does that bother you?" "It should. Traditional Thelian would say I'm abandoning cultural identity. But honestly," she met his eyes directly, "I think I stopped caring about traditional Thelian approval the moment you told me I was beautiful and meant it. Your honest directness disrupted everything I thought I believed about appropriate behavior." "Is that good or bad?" "It's revolutionary, unsettling, also possibly the best thing that's happened to me in years." They talked for hours that afternoon, mapping out what a relationship between them might look like, navigating the spaces between human directness and Thelian formality. It wasn't simple. There were cultural differences that didn't have easy solutions, biological considerations neither of them fully understood, and the basic challenge of being together in the confined environment of a cargo vessel, where privacy was limited and crew judgment was inevitable. But they also discovered they were both willing to figure it out. When Ethan was finally cleared for duty, returning to his cargo operations with a clean bill of health and some impressive scarring on his leg, the dynamic on the Meridian had shifted noticeably. Senna no longer isolated herself in her quarters during off hours. She appeared regularly in the crew galley, joined conversations that included multiple crew members, even participated in the weekly ship-wide briefing with questions and observations, instead of silent attendance. The crew adapted with varying degrees of grace. Some, like Carrie's, were openly supportive and occasionally insufferable about how they'd totally seen this coming. Others, like Chief Engineer Voss, didn't particularly care about personal relationships as long as professional work remained unaffected. Captain Torres maintained her pragmatic stance. As long as ship operations functioned smoothly, crew members' personal lives were their own business. The real test came when they docked at a major station for extended maintenance, and the crew had several days of shore leave. Ethan and Senna spent the time exploring the station together, something that felt simultaneously natural and radical given how carefully they'd navigated their relationship's development. They drew attention. A human and a Thelian together wasn't uncommon enough to be shocking, but it was unusual enough that people noticed. Senna's markings, which she'd spent years trying to minimize in public spaces, blazed with colors that clearly indicated emotional content even to those who couldn't fully interpret them. "Everyone's watching," she observed as they walked through the station's market district. "Does it bother you?" "I thought it would, but mostly I find I don't care what strangers think." Her markings shifted to warm golds. "I spent too many years caring what everyone thought about my emotional control. I'm tired of it." They ended up in a station cafe, drinking beverages that approximated coffee and tea while watching the diverse crowd flow past. Senna's markings drew occasional glances, but mostly they were left alone. Just another mixed species pair among hundreds on a station that served as a crossroads for dozens of cultures. "I've been thinking about your original question," Ethan said eventually. "Which question?" "Why are your eyes always on me? You asked that 6 weeks ago in the cargo bay." "I remember. You said I was beautiful and completely disrupted my understanding of our working relationship." "Right, but I've been thinking about the answer more thoroughly." He set down his drink. "I watch you because you're beautiful, yes, but also because you're competent, intelligent, brave enough to work in spaces where your culture says you don't belong. Because your markings are honest even when you're trying to maintain control. Because you question assumptions and make your own decisions even when they're difficult." Her markings flared so bright they were visible even in the cafe's ambient lighting. "You're going to make me emotional in public." "Your markings are already making you emotional in public." "True, though I'm discovering I mind that less than I expected." She reached across the table, taking his hand in a gesture that was still somewhat bold by Thelian standards. "For the record, my eyes are on you too. Have been since you confessed attraction while looking absolutely horrified that you'd violated cultural protocols." "I was horrified." "I know, it was endearing. Also the beginning of everything changing." They stayed at the cafe for hours, talking about their pasts, their different cultures, the relationship they were building that didn't fit neatly into either human or Thelian frameworks. When they finally returned to the Meridian, shore leave ending and regular operations resuming, something fundamental had solidified between them. The weeks that followed established new patterns. Senna's quarters remained her private space, but she spent increasing amounts of time in communal areas. She developed friendships with crew members who'd previously given her cautious distance, discovering that her earlier isolation had been partly self-fulfilling prophecy. People had left her alone because she seemed to want isolation, and she'd isolated because people left her alone. Ethan's careful watching had been replaced by open attention that neither of them bothered to hide anymore. When they were in the same space, they gravitated toward each other naturally. Her markings responded to his presence with colors that the crew learned to recognize as contentment and affection. Not everything was easy. There were moments of cultural disconnect, where human assumptions clashed with Thelian protocols, and they had to navigate misunderstandings. There were practical complications about physical compatibility that required research and careful communication. There were occasional comments from crew members or strangers at stations that ranged from curious to judgmental. But there were also moments of unexpected joy. Senna teaching Ethan to read her markings with increasing accuracy, until he could interpret subtle emotional shifts that most non-Thelian would miss. Ethan introducing Senna to human music and discovering she had strong opinions about percussion instruments. Both of them learning that cross-cultural relationships required constant effort, but could be worth that effort. 4 months after that initial confrontation in the cargo bay, a new crew member joined the Meridian, a human cargo handler replacing someone who'd transferred to a station posting. The new arrival, a woman named Tors, no relation to the captain despite the surname confusion this caused, reacted to Senna with the typical wariness humans often showed toward Thelian presence. Ethan watched Tors carefully maintain distance during their first shared shift, noticed the way she tracked Senna's movements with the kind of monitoring attention he remembered from his own early behavior. But where Ethan's watching had been fascination poorly concealed, Tors seemed more like cautious uncertainty about the Thelian navigator who looked so different from human norms. During a break, Ethan approached Tors directly. "You're watching our navigator." Tors looked uncomfortable. "I don't mean to stare. It's just Thelian are uncommon on cargo vessels. I've never worked with one before. Don't want to do anything inappropriate." "Best advice. Just treat her like any other crew member. She's competent, professional, and actually pretty friendly once you get past the formal surface." He paused. "Also, staring is fine as long as you're not doing it because you find her unsettling. She's had enough of people treating her like she's strange." "She's not strange, just different, interesting." Ethan smiled, recognizing something in Tor's tone. "Interesting, right." Over the next week, he watched Tor's interaction patterns with the crew and noticed she seemed to seek out opportunities to be in spaces where Senna was working. The watching wasn't quite as obvious as Ethan's had been, but it was definitely present. He mentioned this to Senna during one of their evening conversations in the observation deck, their preferred space for private talks. "New crew member seems interested in you." Senna's markings showed amusement. "I've noticed. She watches when she thinks I'm not paying attention. Reminds you of anyone." "Distinctly, though I'm not going to confront her about it the way I confronted you." Her markings shifted to warm colors. "That approach worked precisely once. I'm not going to assume it's a reliable strategy." "What will you do?" "Nothing. If she's interested, she'll work up the courage to actually speak to me. If she's just curious, she'll stop watching once the novelty wears off." Senna leaned against him, a casual gesture of affection that had become natural between them. "Besides, I'm already invested in one human who couldn't stop staring. That's probably enough for any reasonable person." "Probably, though I'm still staring for the record." "I know, your eyes are always on me, human." Her markings flared bright gold. "I've discovered I prefer it that way." They remained in the observation deck, watching stars stream past during FTL travel. Two people from different worlds who'd found each other because someone had been honest enough to ask a confrontational question and brave enough to give an honest answer. The Meridian's hope continued its route through frontier space, carrying cargo and crew toward whatever destinations came next. In the navigator's station, Senna's stellar charts showed the paths they'd take. In the cargo bays, Ethan's manifests tracked what they carried. And in the spaces between work shifts and formal protocols, they built something that belonged to both their cultures and neither. Something honest, earned, and worth every awkward conversation and cultural negotiation it required. Sometimes the most important questions were the confrontational ones asked.